This read aloud about westward expansion is called Westward on the Oregon Trail. In our last read aloud, we talked about the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee were forced to leave their homes on the East Coast and move farther west. They did not want or choose to move. Other settlers chose to move west on their own because they were looking for a better life. You may remember in our first lesson the story about a family who moved to the west by choice. Let's take a look at some vocabulary words in our read aloud today. The first word is hardships. Difficult conditions or situations that cause discomfort and or suffering. The next word is ruts. Grooves worn into soft ground. And the last word is scout. A person sent ahead of a traveling group to gather information about what lies ahead. Some of the settlers who chose to leave their homes and move farther and farther west followed a route called the Oregon Trail because it led to the Oregon Territory. A territory is an area of land that belongs to a country's government, but isn't yet a state or province. So the Oregon Territory belonged to the U.S. government, but wasn't yet an official state. California, Iowa, and Missouri were states at this time, but the other sections of land shown were territories. The Oregon Trail was a path through the wilderness beginning in the state of Missouri and ending in the Oregon Territory. This trail covered about 2,000 miles and took about 6 months to complete. I want you to listen carefully to determine the main topic of the read aloud and to learn more about how pioneers traveled and what it was like to travel on the Oregon Trail. Let's begin. The wagon train was moving westward along the Oregon Trail. The families walked beside or rode in large covered wagons pulled by oxen. Each family had only one wagon, but that wagon was able to hold almost everything the family owned. Each family packed food, things like flour, potatoes, and beans. They took clothes, blankets, soap, candles, furniture, pots and pans, china, and rifles. They even had to take barrels of water with them because they weren't sure where they might find clean water along the way. By the time everything was packed in the wagon, there wasn't a whole lot of room for much else. In addition to the oxen that pull the wagons, some families brought other animals such as horses, sheep, and cows. These animals didn't go inside the covered wagons. Instead, they were tied to the wagons with rope and walked behind or beside the wagons. Many of these families were headed to the Oregon Territory, where they planned to settle and make new homes. Back in the East, it had become too expensive for the settlers to be able to own their own land. They hoped that by traveling west, they might find a place to build their own homes. Others chose to go for the adventure of starting a new life. The road west had been challenging already. The wagon train had been traveling for 3 long months. The settlers were following a rough or uneven trail of wagon ruts to the Oregon Territory. After many wagons followed one path, the ruts became so deep that it was very difficult or even impossible for wagons to travel without getting stuck. As much of the Oregon Trail went through what was known as Indian Territory, the travelers encountered Native American tribes along the way. Sometimes the Native Americans were fearful that the settlers would decide to stop traveling and just make farms right there on their lands. On this particular day, the wagon train moved slowly in 100-degree heat. Thomas Lawrence, a settler and the wagon train scout, rode quickly over to the leader of the wagon train, Captain Jeremiah Ward, to report on the trail ahead. "There's water half a mile ahead, but it's not fit for drinking," Mr. Lawrence reported. "We ought to reach Sweetwater River by noon, though, and that water is safe." Captain Ward nodded his thanks. "Good work, Thomas." When the wagons reached the Sweetwater River, everyone enjoyed a long, cool drink. Captain Ward ordered, "First, we'll take the wagons and the oxen across the river. Then we'll swim the extra horses over. The cattle will go last." To lighten their loads for the crossing, families removed any heavy objects from their wagons. The settlers brought many of these items to have in their new homes to remind them of their homes back in the East. Now, many of these items they'd hoped to have in their new homes had to be left behind. Fortunately, everyone crossed safely. Once everyone was across and settled, they refilled their water barrels and canteens. They would need the fresh water for the next portion of their trip. Then they set up camp for the night. They made small campfires over which they cooked their food, beans, and bacon. Less than an hour after darkness fell, when most of the travelers were sleeping in their tents or wagons, the wind began to rise, whooshing across the plains. Thomas Lawrence, who was watching the cattle, could hear rumbling off in the distance. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the night sky. The next instant, a blinding rain fell on the sleeping pioneers. Then, out of nowhere, the wind blew so hard that half the tents blew over. Those who had been in tents ran to their wagons, squeezing into any space they could find amid the furniture and supplies. Still, everyone was already soaking wet, and even tying the canvas flap shut could not keep some rain from blowing in. Inside the Lawrence family's wagon, everyone huddled together shivering. 9-year-old Barbara said, "Folks call these wagons prairie schooners, Mama, as if they were schooner ships sailing the wide open land instead of the sea. I didn't really think the schooner ships and our prairie schooner were that much alike. But with that wind rocking the wagon back and forth, I feel as if we are really at sea." 6-year-old Abigail whispered, "I wish we were home." At that moment, the canvas flaps opened and Thomas Lawrence joined his family inside the wagon. Abigail asked, "Papa, why aren't you with the cattle?" He explained, "That first lightning bolt spooked them so much that they ran off. We'll have to round them up after the storm." After a cold, miserable night, the morning dawned cool and gray. Abigail awoke to the sound of a bell. Peering out, she exclaimed, "Why, it's Snowbell! She's found her way back!" Sure enough, the Lawrence's milk cow was standing outside the wagon, ready to be milked. Mr. Lawrence told his wife, "Patricia, have one of the boys milk her. I have an idea." Mr. Lawrence trudged or walked heavily through the thick mud to Captain Ward's wagon. Captain Ward was already up helping other people. "Our milk cow came home," Mr. Lawrence reported. "If we can follow her tracks, maybe we'll find some of the other animals." Captain Ward agreed, and so on horseback, Thomas Lawrence and some other men followed the cow's tracks back to where she had been. Beyond a grove of trees, they found the missing animals calmly chewing the wet prairie grass as if nothing had happened. Mr. Lawrence rode back over to his wife near the family wagon and joked, "Well, that certainly was fun," she replied. "Let's hope we've seen the worst of the Oregon Trail." But 2 months later, the trail presented one last challenge to the pioneers. They were crossing the high mountains of the eastern part of the Oregon Territory on their way to the Green Valley below. That day, Captain Jeremiah Ward and Thomas Lawrence stood together and looked down at the steep mountain trail ahead. The captain said, We have to take this steep path down. There's no other way. If we turn back to take the southern trail, we'd lose too much time. Then we'd never make it out of these mountains before the winter snow hits us." Mr. Lawrence agreed. "It is the only way, but it will be difficult. When I scouted ahead," he said, "I found that the forest crowds in too closely for a wagon to travel on either side of the trail, so we must take the trail itself. At least this extremely steep stretch is fairly short, only about 160 feet. Then the trail levels out and it's good condition again. Once we make it down the hill, the trail will be much easier." Fortunately, Captain Ward had a plan. "Tell everyone to unhitch the oxen from the front of the wagons and reconnect them to the back. We'll walk with them on the paths on either side of the trail, and the oxen will be able to hold the weight of each wagon so that it doesn't slide down. After the wagons are down, our families can follow on foot. We'll bring the herds down last." Half an hour later, the first wagon started down the steep trail. 6 oxen, attached to the wagon by ropes or chains, strained to keep the Lawrence's wagon under control on the bumpy, uneven surface. Watching from the top of the hill was Mrs. Lawrence and the children. As they watched the wagon descend, Mrs. Lawrence said, "It will be a miracle if my china doesn't shatter to pieces with all that bouncing and banging." After what seemed like a lifetime, there came a cry from the bottom of the incline. "We're down, and everything's in one piece." Everyone cheered, and Captain Ward ordered the men to move the rest of the wagons. By the end of the day, everyone had made it down to the bottom. That night, camping beside a clean flowing stream, Captain Ward announced, "Tomorrow we'll be out of these mountains, and then we're almost home." 10 days later, Captain Ward led his wagon train out of a forest and into a lush green valley spread out as far as the eye could see. As each wagon emerged from the trees and each family saw the valley ahead, everyone fell silent. This was the place that the travelers had dreamed about and worked to reach through 6 months of hardships or difficulties, and laughter, rain and hail, wind and heat. Let's take a look at our timeline. In the last read aloud, we added the picture of the Trail of Tears. In today's read aloud, we talked about the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was mainly used in the 1840s and 1850s, which was a few years after the Cherokee were forced to relocate to present-day Oklahoma. Where should we put this picture on our timeline? We will put it right here after the Trail of Tears. Here are some discussion questions. Feel free to pause the video in order to allow time to think and discuss. What was the main topic of the read aloud? What was the Oregon Trail? How did pioneer families travel on the Oregon Trail? About how long did it take a pioneer family to travel the Oregon Trail? Why did some families decide to pack all of their belongings in covered wagons and move to the Oregon Territory? Did families usually travel by themselves on the Oregon Trail or in groups? Why do you think families traveled in wagon trains with a scout riding ahead of them rather than by themselves? Who already lived in the territory or area through which the Oregon Trail passed? How did they feel about the settlers on the Oregon Trail? What difficulties did families face as they traveled on the Oregon Trail? What are some of the animals that the pioneers took with them on the Oregon Trail? How do you think they were helpful to the pioneers? How was the Oregon Trail different from the roads and highways we have today? The read aloud said that sometimes throughout the journey on the Oregon Trail, families had to leave personal items behind to lighten their wagon loads. How do you think families decided what to keep and what to leave behind?